Well, I think by this point, two facts are utterly incontrovertible in terms of the American scene. Number one, we're going on a cruise with BillWhittle.com in May, and we're going to have a blast. We're selling tickets like crazy, and we'd love to have you join us. The link is below. I think the second thing that's incontrovertibly true in America is that the only people who voted for Donald Trump were old, white racists, stupid people probably that had some kind of religion or something that barred them from, being the kind of educated people that you would, of course, naturally be if you were a progressive. And everybody knows, of course, that the really smartest people are in college. So what do you possibly say about this? Well, Steve, Twitter, of course, immediately explained this space-time anomaly, Donald Trump being applauded by young people, by saying, there's a number of theories to explain this bizarre inversion of the laws of physics. One of them was that the applause had been piped in, that it was brought in over the sound system, which doesn't sound like it to me. Other people said that President Trump was not the one they were applauding. They were applauding for the team. They just withheld their applause until the moment that the president joined the team on the stage and so on. And we've got a few others that I'll save for Scott. But here's my point. This is the response to this is an example of the cognitive dissonance that you see among the left when they are presented with evidence that their theories about things are incorrect. There's never a moment of reflection, never a moment like, well, he's getting cheered by college kids. We may be in some trouble. No, there's got to be some explanation for what I believe is absolutely right, despite what my lying eyes are telling me.
Yeah. There are a couple of ways we can slice this. The first and most obvious is probably Occam's razor. That's Occam's razor is the most likely or the least complicated explanation is probably the correct explanation. Or we can go to one of my favorite characters from all of fiction, Sherlock Holmes, who said that once you've eliminated the impossible, all that remains is what actually happened. So I think in this case, if we apply either one of these tests, we come back to the same conclusion as to what happened in that stadium, and it's Russian mind control beams.
That's exactly what it is.
It's
no question about it. Hypnotic suggestions were placed by Russian bots on Facebook, and when somebody gave the secret word signal, all of the students immediately responded.
The rays flash from the overhead Russian stealth drone, and the applause erupted.
What does that tell you?
As programmed.
What does that tell you about this philosophy? What does it tell? Let me rephrase that. What does it tell you about this ironclad protection of this philosophy, this idea that progressivism is loved by everybody. Everybody thinks it's wonderful. Everybody hates Donald Trump. There aren't any people in the country who are sane who voted for him, and certainly no good people. What does it say about this philosophy that it has to be encased in this titanium outer hull, which can never be breached under any circumstances?
You remember George W. Bush throwing out that beautiful first pitch at the World Series in Yankee Stadium right after 9/11. And he walked out into that stadium, and even before he threw the pitch, and by the way, it was a brilliant strike from the mound. I don't think a president's ever thrown a better pitch than that.
I don't either.
New York City, where I think there were about 12 people who actually voted for him in November of 2000, that stadium erupted in support for him because 9/11 had just happened. His response to it in those early days was as solid as you could possibly have imagine, and that won him a lot of support. Donald Trump just did something pretty remarkable in pursuing America's interests outside the Baghdad airport a couple of weeks ago. And I have to wonder if some of the cheers might have been for that, for the same reason that New Yorkers cheered for George W. Bush. That aside, let me tell you a little story here. I was a teenager in the 80s, and the 80s were inarguably awesome. They were the most awesome time that ever could or would be. And they were gnarly. I started at University of Missouri in the fall of '87, and I was taking political science from Professor Richard Hardy, who was number one, the only Republican on the poli-sci department, and also gave the only unbiased lectures in the entire poli-sci department. He was really beloved, and he threw a mock election every 4 years, a mock presidential election involving his entire I think it was just the poli-sci 101 class, but it had to be like 600 or 700 kids at the time, divided up among the week's worth of lectures. And it was held over 4 nights in the spring, just as Iowa was kicking off. And the first 2 nights were devoted to recreating both parties' primaries. And then the third night, and these weren't all in a row, I think it was spread out over 2 weeks. The third night was each party's convention. And then on the last night, all the Democrat and Republican college students would get together and divide it by states and hold a mock election. And Professor Hardy had been doing this, I think, since 1976. And this was for the 1988 election. And he had predicted, his mock election, I should say, predicted the election results with spooky accuracy for every single election from 1976 until 1988, which is the year that I did it. And I was actually the campaign manager for Pete DuPont. And we would have been the vice presidential nominee behind Bush, except the primary night was held as the same night as the Iowa caucus, which Bob Dole won in the real world, and news was filtering that Bob Dole was winning, and so there was a big shift to support. But other than that, the Democrat kids chose Mike Dukakis, and I can't remember who his running mate was, and it ended up being Bob Dole instead of George Bush, but only just barely, wiping out Mike Dukakis in a landslide. And keep in mind, this was happening in January of '88, so this mock election was really, really solid. And the reason I tell you this story is Professor Hardy had to go to great lengths to get his student body to accurately reflect the American electorate. And the reason he had to be so very smart about how he did this is back in the 80s, which I've already stated are inarguably awesome, college Republicans outnumbered the young Democrats by 2-1. Now, you go back to that same Mizzou campus today, and what do you think it is? 3-1, 4-1 for the young Democrats over the college Republicans? So clearly, this age is not nearly so awesome. But if what we saw there at that stadium is any kind of indication of a sea change, Bill, maybe the awesome 80s all over again.
Scott, Steve mentioned that Sherlock Holmes' famous dictum, once you eliminate the impossible, all you're left with is the truth.
Thank you. I couldn't remember the exact words. Something
like that. However, we have not eliminated all of the possibilities. One of the progressives responding to Trump's entry into the stadium said that, well, of course he's supported down there. That was in the South. And you know how those people are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, here's how those people are. Clemson is a little university in South Carolina, which President Trump carried by almost 15 points over Hillary Clinton. And Louisiana State University is, of course, in Louisiana, a state which President Trump carried by some 20 points over Hillary Clinton. So it might be reasonable to assume that fans and alumni and students from those states might be a little more inclined than, say, your average Manhattanite or somebody who lives in Sherman Oaks, California might be.
But I'm sure that's not where the argument was directed. We know where the argument was directed.
I know exactly the way the argument's directed, but I don't think I need to glorify that ridiculous argument with a response. Anybody who is suggesting that somehow there are regions of this country that are, sort of more primordial than those that are enlightened is being ridiculous. I think what you saw is due to a number of factors. Number one, first of all, those who are criticizing this need to take into account the fact that between Los Angeles and New York City, there's not an inland ocean. There's actually land there, and people live on that land. And people have lives in the middle of the country between New York and Los Angeles that are altogether different from the way you might suppose. And they see things differently. In fact, one of the reasons why the framers of the Constitution work from this model of saying we better create a federated republic because the interests in various regions of the country are varied, and we want to make sure we accurately represent those varied interests. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for civil conflict by allowing just population centers to dominate and to subjugate the people across the country. So in any case, there's this vast middle of the country that sees things different than you do in your little, ivory tower university cloister. The other thing is, those kind of people, we know who those people are. You know what kind of people those people are? Those are the kind of people that when the President of the United States walks into a football stadium where they're going to play for the national championship, they get excited. And they say, look, it's the President of the United States. They're American people. They're people who look at the President of the United States not just as who he is as a political partisan, but they're excited because, in a way, he embodies and is a figurehead for the country as a whole. And they're excited they know they're going to be able to come home and say, hey, not only did I see a great football game, but guess who was there? The President of the United States was in the stadium. I was within a few feet of him.
That's pretty cool.
It was awesome. And then finally, there's this. Oh, by the way, those who think that they piped in that applause, I would invite you to call up the, what do you think, 20,000, 30,000 cell phone videos that might have been made simultaneously at that time. I'm just guessing on a figure there. You might scan the social media feeds. I'm sure you'll find some videos where somebody was going, boo. But I think you'll find that the cell phone videos of the incident from many, many angles with many audio feeds might be able to either hold up or destroy your theory. And then finally, and this is probably most important of all, did you see Melania Trump's coat? That thing was fantastic. I think about half the people in the stadium were excited to see Melania Trump in that coat as they were to see the President of the United States. I'm being facetious when it comes to that, but ladies and gentlemen, let me just end with a personal note. I was driving when we used to live in Missouri, and we were driving past Independence, Missouri at one point, and on the radio, we heard an explanation for why we were experiencing slow traffic. And the reason was because the President of the United States was speaking on the square in Independence, Missouri. And so traffic was backed up for that. Well, my wife and I said, the President of the United States is speaking on the square in Independence, Missouri. We're here. Let's go see him because he's the president. And so we found a place to park and we walked for a long distance. And as we got within several blocks of the downtown square, we were stopped by police and Secret Service and all that. And they said, no, you had to have been here like 6 hours ago to get in here to see the President of the United States. We were crestfallen because we wanted to see him. That president was William Jefferson Clinton, a man for whom I had no love, no respect, and total disagreement with his principles. But you know what? He was the President of the United States. And I got this close to seeing the President of the United States in person, right down the street from Harry Truman's library, which is also pretty cool.
Yeah.
Watching the reaction to this among the left, the only example of the kind of mental gymnastics you have to do to overcome this cognitive dissonance of seeing evidence that you don't want to see. The only thing I can possibly come up with that comes even close to that was that famous occasion in American history when Montgomery Burns got on stage and was roundly booed, and he turned to Smithers and say, "Are they saying boo or boo-earns?" Oh, they're saying boo-earns. Yes, that's it. They're all shouting boo-earns, boo-earns. They love me. This is the kind of thing you have to do in order to maintain yourself in your little ego bubble. Look, it's a problem for the left, and it's a problem for the left the same way that Kanye West is a problem for the left, and not just with Donald Trump, but any time somebody like Martina Navratilova comes out and says, "Of course I couldn't beat the best male player in the world," and all of these things that have to be excommunicated, chopped off, blocked off, erased from history, covered up, put a nice little garden and grass on the top and pretend it was never there. All of these things go counter to the narrative, and there is no admitting that there is anything counter to the narrative. This is precisely how totalitarian governments and political parties function. This is what we say is the absolute and only truth, and nothing else is. And so in order to protect your political purity, we'll make sure that you don't hear anything that disagrees with the official party line. Donald Trump was only elected by old white racists. Idiots, stupid people voted for Donald Trump. So if a college of young people is applauding the president, there's got to be some nefarious reason why this particular example was a fluke. And this is why they're going to get their butts handed to them and why they deserve it so very much, so very much. This elitist, snobby, we know what's better for you than you do, because I studied medieval poetry in the Italian language in which it was written. Therefore, I'm much more qualified to teach you how to run your gas station than you are. This attitude, this better than you attitude from half smart people who try to convince themselves that they're really, really brilliant has got to go. Donald Trump's election was here basically as a fight for the regular citizens against the elite. And if I genuinely thought there was any evidence whatsoever that these people were in fact smarter than we are, I would at the very least listen with the same kind of respect that I listen to when I run into an engineer or somebody who is clearly smarter than I am in a particular area. But what I find to the contrary is the reason that all of this stuff has to be constantly excluded is because these people are idiots and they cannot defend their own philosophy. They just don't even know what it is. So what I saw there at the national championship game was essentially 100,000 people making a statement and then watching every single progressive in the country do this. You know, na, I can't hear you, so it didn't happen. It's not true. If Donald Trump had been booed, this would not have been unexpected. But the fact that he was cheered by young college students is a bit of a shock, not only to the left, but a little bit of a shock to me as well, and a pleasant one, which leads me to think that this might be quite a good year with a happy outcome. And I'd also like to remind you that if you'd like to celebrate in advance, don't get cocky, kid. We'd love to see you out there on the high seas on our Strata Cruise 2020, which is going to be in May with Stephen Scott. Everybody's signing up. We're selling them like hotcakes. We'd love to have you there so you can come and meet some of your best friends who you don't know yet. For Steve and Scott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week on Right Angle.